Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to give this talk. I think I'd better correct you on one thing. Black and white television was all we had until 1968. Marcus and I can remember quite well the days of black and white, I suspect. Okay, secular stagnation has become quite a hot topic in sort of like macroeconomics and so on. And I thought I'd give this talk to you because I was asked to give a similar one to a conference at the Austrian Central Bank about 2 months ago. They thought it was interesting, so let's see if you do. Okay, a historical perspective, well, my speciality is economic history, but economic history used to illuminate what we know and think about the present. So there will be some historical stuff here, but much of it is about what's happening now. So we might just want to start off by checking what secular stagnation means. And I think it is a somewhat ambiguous concept, or at least it's used by different people to talk about different things. All of them, I think, would be ideas which say macroeconomic performance is rather weak. They're ideas which say that the economy might have high unemployment or low growth or some combination of the two. Nevertheless, if we look at what's out there, Larry Summers it was who reintroduced this idea into popular discourse. And I think Summers' perspective, when he gave that talk, which sort of went viral almost immediately, was really about what was happening in the United States at the time, perhaps in Europe at the time, and it was on the basis of saying after the crisis recovery has been quite weak, and was along the lines of saying that recovery has been so weak that it's almost as though the United States, or perhaps Europe, would be in a kind of permanent liquidity trap, i.e. it would have very low nominal interest rates. In order actually to stimulate the economy and return to an appropriate level of economic activity, Summers argued you might need a negative real interest rate. And the only way you can get a negative real interest rate once you're at this lower band, the ZLB, the zero lower band, is presumably by creating inflation, or perhaps more accurately, creating inflationary expectations. So that would be something which might even be difficult to do. It certainly might be difficult to do for an inflation targeting central bank. So Summers' sort of worry there is you might get stuck. The implication could be that you should try and do something like use fiscal policy actively because monetary policy is difficult to use to get out of the problem. The most famous proponent of the idea of secular stagnation in economic history was Alan Hansen. Alan Hansen became very well known as an early acolyte of Keynes, and he was perhaps one of the most important popularizers of Keynes's ideas in the United States in the later 1930s on through probably the couple of decades after World War II. Hansen, over time, changed his mind about what the problem might be, and the variants that he has give us, I think, two more ideas for secular stagnation. So the second idea, these are neatly highlighted in red since we've got the colour back, is that the problem might be that the trend rate of growth is very low. So that you've entered a phase where productivity isn't going to increase very much, where productive potential isn't going to increase very much, where the economy's ability to grow is held back. And Hansen, I think, pointed to two things which are still potentially relevant today. One, that advanced economies might find themselves with very slow population growth, very slow growth of the labour force, or possibly even a declining labour force, depending on what happened to demographic conditions. But basically this would be probably a low birth rate world, and possibly one where birth rates are too low to maintain the population. We can think of countries at the moment which definitely face that future, including, of course, China, but Hansen was talking about the United States. The second thing that Hansen worried about was that technological progress was going to dry up. That technological progress would in future be very slow, so that labour productivity wouldn't grow very quickly. You can think of that as holding back growth as well. Now that might be related to the first problem if you think that once the business sector sees a very low growth environment, it might in fact it might be the case that that would be pretty much of a downer on investment, so that investment demand would be very weak, and the investment demand being weak would itself depress aggregate demand in the short term and lead to this need for a negative real interest rate or whatever. So that was Hansen in his most famous version of secular stagnation, which was his presidential address to the American Economic Association in 1938, published in 1939. If you, as economic historians are wont to do, look through what Alan Hansen wrote at other times in his life, actually I think he has a third issue to worry about. This is not slow growth, but persistent high unemployment. Now, persistent high unemployment in Hansen's various writings could come from at least a couple of different reasons. One might actually be that technological progress, instead of being too slow, was in some sense too fast. There is very rapid technological progress, and the economy's rate of growth of demand is insufficient to keep up with that. And the implication is there's increasing slack in the labour force and unemployment emerges as a problem. And I think that's the position that Hansen came to as a possibility slightly later. There's a well-known book of his in 1951 which I think looks at that. And for people who like their economic theory, it's probably linked to ideas that come from Roy Harrod, the Harrod-Domar model and of growth and so on. An earlier version of Hansen, in 1932, also worried about technological unemployment, but not so much because technological progress would necessarily be too fast, but rather because the technological progress would lead to what Hansen and other Americans of his vintage called technological unemployment. And I think what that emerges as by the time they had a bit of an argument is that somehow the labour market isn't flexible enough to adjust to the technological progress. So that wages and prices may need to be flexible, possibly even flexible downwards, to cope with that, and maybe they weren't. And Hansen was among that group of Americans who worried about sort of oligopolistic tendencies, lack of price and wage flexibility, and so on. I think whichever of these flavours of secular stagnation you worry about, Europe is more vulnerable than the United States. Which is odd, really, because all the hype has originally come from the United States, both in the 1930s and in the 2010s. Why would I have this claim? And you can perhaps explore it at the end in questions if you want a bit more. I think the first story is that trend growth in Europe is clearly lower than in the United States, in pretty much all of Western Europe, not necessarily in the transition economies of Eastern Europe, not necessarily in countries like Ireland. There are exceptions, but nevertheless, I think generally speaking, and I'll show you some numbers from projections in a little while, trend growth, if you're worried about low trend growth, you should be more worried about Europe. Europe is less good at achieving technological progress and has slightly less good demography than the United States. Secondly, if you are worried about being in a depressed economy, one of the things that might help you would indeed be a commitment to unconventional monetary stimulus. This is linked to the idea of increasing inflationary expectations. If you ask about the mandate of the central banks in question, if you ask about their behaviour in the last several years, I think it's pretty clear the Fed is much more likely to try to be active in a depressed economy than the European Central Bank. The ECB is almost exactly the wrong sort of central bank for those conditions. Thirdly, if your worry is about technological change, I think the modern version of that would actually be more like Hansen 1932. It would be an argument about whether labour markets are flexible enough to redeploy labour quickly and efficiently and avoid unemployment coming? Well, I think the issue that we're going to look at is there is likely to be, I think, pretty strong skill bias in future technological change. I think that's going to put a lot of pressure on the labour market to deal with unemployment among low-skilled and lowly educated workers. If that's the case, then the track record and what we know about labour market institutions and policies, once again, the typical European country is much less likely to be able to cope well than the United States. Finally, Alan Hansen, actually when he became this acolyte of Keynes, actually brightened up. He said to himself, goodness me, we can actually do something about aggregate demand being too low. In particular, as good Keynesians, we can go for deficit-financed government expenditure. Or at least we can if we've got enough fiscal space. We're not going to worry about or run into problems of fiscal sustainability. The other things equal, the problems of fiscal sustainability that you have depend on how big your debt to GDP ratio is, but also on how fast growth might be in future. I think, given where we are at the moment, fiscal sustainability is more problematic in Europe, and therefore there may be less fiscal space. Having lived in America for several years, I had a strong view about certain American characteristics, and I did think they were pretty prone to hypochondria. This was very much informed by watching commercial advertisements on American television, particularly in the days when they were allowed to advertise things you wouldn't have been able to look at in Britain. All sorts of ailments which they were offering potions for, which you wouldn't have been allowed to talk about on British TV, but Americans seem to be obsessed by. Hence my comment at the bottom. I think both then and now, in the 1930s and today, Europeans today certainly have some good reasons to worry. I doubt the Americans have very much reason to worry at all. And I've used that rather rude expression. If some of you are American, I do apologise. No, I don't apologise. I revel in it. American hypochondria. I think there's an American running the sentence. Okay, we could probably skip this slide. It may not mean very much to most of you, but with Hansen with his Keynesian hat on, I think he would probably have thought about a golden age growth regime in which, if the natural rate of growth, and the rate of growth of the labour force, mu, the rate of growth of labour augmenting technological progress, if that goes down and people still want the same capital to output ratio, then you'd expect investment to get pushed down. And the Keynesians did have this phrase. Several of my teachers in Cambridge when I was very young loved this phrase, the bastard golden age, in which expectations of the business sector are perfectly well satisfied, but growth just carries on at too low a rate. And with growth too low relative to the growth of the natural rate of growth or productive potential, unemployment might result. Hansen thought you could deal with this by, or later on in his life, thought you could deal with this by fiscal policy. Maybe, maybe not. Okay, so I love these sorts of slides. I've got a much better one, but it's not appropriate for this lecture, which says, why was Robert Solow wrong? I like attacking big names, and Hansen's not really a big enough name, but he'll have to do for this afternoon. So why was Alan Hansen wrong? And believe me, he was spectacularly wrong. This goes along with Irving Fisher's prediction in 1929 about share prices, and perhaps one or two other famous economist errors. I think there were three reasons why Alan Hansen was wrong, and they relate to each of the types of secular stagnation. Firstly, even if it's not well known to the general public, the United States in the 1930s actually was already doing a very good job of exiting the state of depressed economy by the time Hansen wrote. And the United States had returned to full employment by 1941 after a massively traumatic shock in the early 1930s. My own take on where the macroeconomic policy stimulus came from in the United States in the 1930s is that it came from what a macro person I think might describe as regime change. Regime change was linked to leaving the gold standard. It was linked to having the New Deal, not as a Keynesian fiscal stimulus, but as something which persuaded people that prices would rise in future. And of course, interest rates, once America had left the gold standard, became very low in nominal terms, and real interest rates on any reasonable calculation did become seriously negative. A lovely paper by Gowty Eggertson in the American Economic Review in 2008 details that story. Subsequent empirical work, I think, backs Eggertson up quite strongly. So regime change changed inflationary expectations, forced the real interest rate down, made it negative, and the United States recovers in the 1930s through what amounts to a really strong monetary stimulus, but that would certainly have looked unconventional in 1932 or 3. Secondly, if you're worried about medium to long-term growth, Hansen was so pessimistic about technological progress at the time when one economic historian has said the United States was in its most technologically progressive decade of the 20th century. The 1930s, the US was already embarked on what Bob Gordon subsequently called the one big wave of productivity growth. It's characterized by very rapid total factor productivity growth. I think that label that the 1930s was actually the strongest of all is probably wrong, but nevertheless, it was a very strong wave of technological progress. The United States was benefiting from the investments it had made in human capital, in R&D, and so on. These were bearing fruit, and bearing fruit very strongly. You've got electricals, you've got automobiles, you've got entertainment, you've got the development of massively more productive distribution sector, and so on. The third thing that I think Hansen was wrong about was the American labour market. Actually, the decades after World War II saw very low unemployment. They did so partly indeed because demand was so strong, it wasn't Keynesian stimulus. But they also did so because I think World War II reversed one of the things that Hansen was worried about, namely the idea that hysteresis would evolve or emerge from the 1930s. In other words, that people who became unemployed became long-term unemployed, became hardcore unemployed, became unemployable, either through their attitudes or loss of skills. The opposite shock of World War II put all those people back to work. And people who empirically investigate the American labour market argue the hysteresis effect has disappeared quite quickly. Those are some numbers on the recovery in the United States in the 1930s. There is certainly a hiccup in 1937, which we could discuss at the end if you want. But just looking between those two yellow rows, the highlighted rows, that is a very rapid recovery. We're talking about growth which is close to 8% a year over those 4 years. There are the numbers on labour productivity growth, just to decipher the notation in case it's not obvious. K upon L is capital to labour ratio. Human capital per labour is HK upon L, and those are the contributions of those variables. So it's capital deepening in the first column, it's human capital deepening in the second column. Then we have the rate of growth of total factor productivity, reflecting this technological progress in particular. And in the last column, the rate of growth of labour productivity. Again, I've conveniently highlighted what I want you to look at. The yellow cells are this very strong period of total factor productivity growth, which starts in the 1920s and goes on roughly till we got colour television at the start of the 1970s or thereabouts. Those numbers are from Alexander Field, and he sees the period 1929 to 1941 as very strong. So Hansen may have been interesting in terms of ideas. He wasn't very good as an empirical economist, or perhaps his forecasts were unfortunate. Okay, with that background, let's turn to the euro area today. I think it would be fair to say that Europe has been struggling. It's been in a very lengthy recession. It's probably emerging from it now. It's possible that this does not reflect permanently lower trend growth. It could just reflect, I think, an adjustment in the level of GDP consequent on the crisis it's been through. But what I think I would want to say to you is that there's been no equivalent of the New Deal in Europe. There is unlikely to be an equivalent of the New Deal. And there is unlikely to be an equivalent of the regime change which the United States engineered in the 1930s. In fact, the architecture of the Eurozone is more or less designed to prevent that. And it has been successful in preventing it. This makes, in the short term, this lovely old English expression, I don't know if this word means anything to you, makes escaping from the doldrums quite difficult. The doldrums, those of you who don't know, this is maritime history. This is sailing ships getting marooned without any wind, floating hopelessly on the open ocean. Yeah, a problem that the British sailor was quite familiar with. Likewise now, the European policymaker. In fact, if you draw pictures of sort of superimposing one experience on another, in the 1930s, we saw economies which undertook regime change escape from the Depression really quickly. I'm not showing the United States there, I'm showing the sterling area. The sterling countries, or sterling-related countries, notably Britain, of course, and Scandinavia, left the gold standard very early. They experienced a rapid recovery, and they are the top line there on the graph. The gold bloc countries, France, Switzerland, the Low Countries and so on, they left the gold standard only very late. They were trapped in the gold standard, if you like. Their recovery takes a very, very long time to materialise. They are, understandably you'll say, the gold line on the graph. Aren't you glad we got the colour back? Okay. What's the red line? Well, I'm starting the two lines for the gold block and the sterling block in 1929, and I'm just saying what happens if you move 1 year on. So I'll start the red line for the euro area from 2007, which I take to be the equivalent year to 1929. Well, what we see is round about now, the euro area looks as though it's just about, relative to the start, where the gold block was in the 1930s. Not at all where the sterling block was. Short-term secular stagnation then at the zero lower bound. Zero lower bound, you can't reduce the nominal interest rate anymore. Or you certainly can't reduce the nominal short-run interest rate anymore. Three ways to address the problem, I think, which emerge from economists' discussions of this. The first is unconventional monetary stimulus. If you can't lower the nominal interest rate, you might still be able to raise inflationary expectations. You might be able to deliver a very large monetary shock. Fiscal stimulus, which says, let's try and raise growth by increasing government expenditure, cutting taxes, some combination of the two, perhaps expecting the multiplier to be quite high at the lower bound of nominal interest rates. Maybe not always, but there are some reasons to believe it certainly could be. And a kind of combination of those two, which might come back to in question time, would in fact be helicopter money. Helicopter money would be the sort of extreme version, I think, which effectively combines something like a tax cut with something like quantitative easing on a pretty big scale. The third thing you might try and do is improve the supply side. Improving the supply side might be in terms of doing things which would raise the rate of growth because you've increased productivity, but in particular you would hope would make investment more attractive. The sort of thing that you might have done in Britain 2 or 3 years ago, if the politicians had had the courage to do it, would have been seriously to liberalise the housing market. Take away large amounts of planning restraints, the equilibrium housing stock would be way above the actual one, The move towards achieving the actual housing stock would require a lot of investment, moving the actual to the equilibrium, and that would trigger some kind of recovery. I think if you think about Europe, it is basically not really able to do any of those things very effectively. Those are the possibilities. I think they're basically all ruled out. Roosevelt's solution of regime change is essentially ruled out by a combination of the Eurozone architecture and specifically the rules around the European Central Bank. So, we know those policies have worked in the past. We know fiscal multipliers can be high at the lower bound. We know regime change worked in the 1930s. We had a crowding in experience in Britain in the 1980s from supply-side reform there of credit rules in the economy. But Europe finds this too difficult. Why? Firstly, it's got the wrong sort of central bank. Secondly, it can't go for fiscal stimulus when it's preoccupied by trying to control levels of sovereign debt because it's so frightened about the exposure of the banking system to large sovereign debt. Thirdly, unfortunately in a way, Europe has pretty strong democracies and pretty entrenched lobbying positions. Supply-side reform usually creates too many losers for the politicians to be willing really to go for it in a big way. The wrong sort of central bank then? I think an economic historian would say to you that the modern tendency to think that the right sort of central bank is independent and targets inflation is quite a modern idea. It's not necessarily the best design in all circumstances. In particular, it's potentially not the best design in a depressed economy. If the key issue is being able credibly to commit to quite high future inflation, regime change, the central bank mandates that we see around the world are geared to avoid that. A subservient central bank, that's Charles Goodhart's phrase, is what happens when the central bank becomes dependent. It gets taken over by the finance ministry, let's say. And then monetary policy might well be run with a view to making government debt management easier, or with a much less attention to addressing inflationary bias. UK had that from probably the 1930s through to the 1970s, essentially. It did end in tears in the 1970s, but in the depressed economy world, it might actually not have been such a bad thing. And the UK in the 1930s, I think, benefited from that. Eurozone countries, I think, don't have a great deal of scope to use fiscal stimulus in some cases while maintaining fiscal sustainability. But even if they did, for most of them, the fiscal compact rules it out. The fiscal compact is Europe's agreement as what to do in the context of this doom loop problem of the feedback effects between sovereign debt and potential bank failure. The fiscal compact says if your debt ratio, government debt to GDP ratio, is relatively high, you agree to reduce it steadily over time. In particular, you agree to return to the Maastricht limit that central government gross debt shouldn't be more than 60% of GDP. That essentially means Europe has committed itself, if the rules were followed, to a long period of fiscal consolidation. That rules out the fiscal stimulus anyway. But if you look at the sort of formula for fiscal sustainability, i.e. for the debt ratio not to change, so delta little d is the change in the ratio of public debt to GDP. Let's consider stability to be, in a simple sense, that ratio shouldn't change, so delta little d equals 0. Then a quite well-known formula is that requires that the primary budget surplus as a fraction of GDP, that's little b, should be equal to, or at least equal to, the debt ratio, little d, times the interest rate you pay on government debt, I, minus the rate of inflation, pi, minus the rate of growth, real growth, G, with high debt to GDP ratios, which is what much of Europe has, that is a pretty challenging formula, even just to sustain the debt ratio at its current level. It would be much easier if you could manipulate the real interest rate permanently to be lower than the growth rate, but that is perhaps not feasible. If secular stagnation in the medium term is interpreted to be slow growth, that makes this harder. If it's interpreted to be very high unemployment, which tends to trigger lots of transfer payments and so on, that also makes it harder. I think if Alan Hansen was here today, he'd be much less optimistic about the possibility for his solution to secular stagnation to do the job. There are some numbers taken from an OECD report of 2014. Notice the troubled economies as they saw them then. Their projections for real interest rates, R is the real interest rate, are quite high compared with what they think the growth rate might be. So R minus G will probably be positive. And a number of these countries have very limited fiscal space. The limit of D is probably the point at which you'd expect the debt dynamics to become seriously difficult. Some countries are challenging that limit already. Okay, so that's the short term. Not very good, I hear you say. Correct. All right, let's look to the medium term, or medium to long term, and let's look at what people are saying about future growth in Europe. There are a number of different ways of doing this. Broadly speaking, the first two that I'll touch on could be thought of as backward-looking, and then the third one is more forward-looking. Backward-looking would essentially be to say, let us ask ourselves, looking at the data, what we think the trend rate of growth has been recently. Okay, so you get out your econometrics, get out your best software package, put your smartest time series head on, and try and work out what you think's been happening to the trend rate of growth. That is necessarily looking back. It's saying what has the data given us. Two ways of doing that. One would simply be to try and extract the trend from what's been happening to GDP. The other would be actually to think about the things which improve productive potential over time and try and find a way of forecasting what's going to happen to total factor productivity, what's going to happen to the labour supply, what's going to happen to the labour supply adjusted for the natural rate of unemployment, those sorts of things. Let me say to you unequivocally, everybody who has done an exercise of that kind, and there are many of them sitting out there, all of them say the trend rate of growth in Europe has become really worryingly low. And it has decreased considerably compared with the late 20th century. I'm old enough to remember that people said very similar things in the 1980s, incidentally, and that was suddenly followed by the ICT revolution. So I'm not sure we should necessarily believe this inference, but that is certainly the inference people are making. Havik et al. Is a European Commission projection based on this production function approach. Look at what they're projecting for 2014 to 23. It's lower growth of labour productivity, GDP per hour worked, than was seen in the period pre-crisis. EA is the original 12 members of the euro area. The EU 15 is the 15 members of the European Union before 2004, conventional areas to look at. You'll see that productivity growth is projected at roughly half what it might have been expected to be before the crisis. Looking at hours worked, there you see some of this demographic stuff kicking in. Hours worked, again, are projected to be about half what they were before the crisis in terms of the growth rate. TFB is noticeably weaker than before. The upshot is that trend rate of growth of real GDP in the European area would be projected to be about half its pre-crisis number. There are other time series approaches, noticeably dynamic factor models, Antolin Diaz et al. Produced one of those recently. It comes to basically very similar conclusions. You might notice that using this method to project future American growth leaves American growth higher, right across the board. Hence my comment about the hypochondria a little while ago. Okay, suppose we had a more forward-looking view. Suppose instead of trying to extract the trend rate of growth from econometrics looking at the past, we said, let's look at the future and ask what the prospects are. Well, most people who've done that aren't quite as pessimistic as the econometricians. It's the econometricians who are in the really pessimistic camp. But people looking forward are perhaps saying some of what's being picked up as trend is really short-term problems rather than long-term difficulties. So John Fennell is perhaps the most senior of these guys, works for the San Francisco Fed. Fennell suggests GDP growth in the United States will be 2% a year. People often cite Robert Gordon as the hyper-pessimist. Bob Gordon thinks that labour productivity growth will be at least 1.3% a year in the United States over the next 15 or 20 years. People who look at technology, I've got various bits of that, strongly say that the ICT revolution is continuing and is maybe not quite as strong in terms of its growth rate effects as in 2000, but it's not dead, it's not disappeared completely. There's likely to be a moving frontier in the leader for European followers to catch up. Looking a little bit more into the growth economics of the future, then I think we get a slightly mixed picture. When some of you were sort of young, economics went through an endogenous growth phase. Got very excited by the idea that you could permanently raise the growth rate in the economy by changing policy and so on. One of the big model claims there was if you raise the share of R&D in the economy, that will permanently raise the growth rate. Would that it were so. The evidence seems to be that that is not the case, that what you actually see when R&D goes up as a fraction of economic activity is a surge in growth in the short term, which then runs into diminishing returns. It's a permutation on the Solow view of the world, essentially. Fernald and Chad Jones argue that what's been happening in the United States is that there have been permanent increases, repeated increases in things which this growth theory thinks will have these semi-endogenous effects. Will raise growth for a notable period of time, but not absolutely permanently. And the two things those authors point to are more people going to college and more R&D, human capital and R&D. Those authors basically say it's extremely unlikely that will continue. These transitory gains have probably come to an end. So that kind of growth model forecast is a bit negative, but Fernald and Jones, being quite smart, don't commit themselves to that. They correctly say two other things might be worth noting. One, that we might be on the eve of a new, very important technological revolution. The robots are coming. Okay, and I want to say quite a bit about the robots before we finish. And the second is that this pessimistic view about the United States is astonishingly inward-looking. It's Americocentric, if you wish. Suppose you thought about the world. Well, other countries are up and coming and are joining the United States as important parts of the research community. Most obviously China, which accounted for very little of world R&D in the mid-1980s, accounted for about 1/6 of world R&D by 2012, and presumably is going to be a bigger share in the near future. If you believe that China is going through this phase of transitory potential gains from more and more R&D, the rest of the world basically benefits from and shares in that. This is creating essentially a public good, if you wish, in the form of more knowledge, which will underpin more of these transitory growth phases. The final thing to note is there's something equivalent, I think, to a rise in R&D spending. It is that I think R&D is likely to become much more productive in future. And that's essentially for the reason that John Mulcair, one of my economic historian colleagues in the United States, points out. He points out that the big legacy of the ICT revolution will be to make doing R&D much easier, much cheaper, much more efficient, because a great part of R&D is basically data analysis. We can do this a lot better in the big data world than we could before. And that is tantamount to, it's equivalent to, a shift up in R&D spending in those old models. What does the OECD project for post-crisis Europe? Well, they actually are quite optimistic. They think growth will bounce back, possibly to be even better than pre-crisis. It's essentially a business-as-usual model that they have, but they think the pre-crisis performance was unusually low. Their model's based on Europe catching up to the United States. What this needs is reasonably good supply-side policies and the United States to continue to advance its productivity growth. This growth model approach is really quite optimistic. So if instead of taking our advice from the European Commission in Brussels, we took our advice from the OECD in Paris, that's the sort of projection that we might get. Oh, we could breathe easier if the world looks like this. It's not nirvana, it's not perfect, it's not a golden age, but goodness me, it doesn't look quite as nasty as that previous forecast. TFP growth is seen here at about double what there was in the previous projection. Real GDP growing in the euro area to about 1.7. There's still possibly minor falling back relative to the United States. But nevertheless, for a number of these countries, that really looks quite promising. And it looks in productivity growth terms a lot better than pre-crisis. So if the Parisian forecast is correct, it looks a bit better. So where have we got to? On this long-term secular stagnation, we've got good news in the sense that I don't think growth in the leader is going to evaporate, the United States. Bad news, however, as I'll show you in a moment, there's scope for Europe to catch up and continue to have its productivity increase as the US will do. But European catch-up ended in the mid-1990s. Before the crisis, Europe was struggling really quite badly. Pre-crisis productivity performance was very poor. And the very bad news? Well, the very bad news might be that the crisis makes supply-side policy worse, not better. And actually also that the problem is not the drying up of technological progress, but going back to the robots, the skill bias. Robot technology is surely going to deliver very heavy skill bias in technological change. Those are the pre-crisis numbers, again on the same basis as the OECD. So please notice that total factor productivity growth was very weak in some parts of Europe, lots of negatives. And against that background, the OECD perhaps looks a touch optimistic. Supply-side reforms do have one attractive feature. That one really attractive feature is that they can be done at the country level. You don't have to have the European Central Bank take action. You don't have to have some European validated fiscal stimulus because you're breaking the rules or whatever. You could do this for yourself. What sorts of things might you try to change? You might try and make the economy more competitive, less regulated. You might try and design taxation so it's less of a burden on growth, probably reducing various marginal tax rates on income. Maybe increasing indirect taxes to compensate. You might invest more in human capital and R&D and perhaps spend less of your government money on other things. As the OECD themselves point out, the economics of this is quite easy. We know what's worked in the past. We know where policy settings are weak or inappropriate in Europe. The difficulty is that politics is very hard. Why is the politics hard? Because this usually creates losers. Think of the simplest sort of thing. If you're going to have technology adapted much more quickly, you're going to have an economy which has a great deal more creative destruction in it. Creative destruction means exit as well as entry. It means job losses as well as job gains. The losers can block that. The technology doesn't get adopted. Think Uber. Yeah? Okay, economic integration, European economic integration was certainly a big driver for this kind of supply-side reform up until the 1990s, but it doesn't seem to be anymore. And one major reason for that is the impetus to completing the single market is extremely weak. Which is a shame because, as those simulations suggest, if you did move to a full liberalisation of the European single market, the effect on GDP after 10 years might well be quite considerable. I don't think we should take that too literally, but just to suggest that there is some scope there. If we look at the OECD's views about what could be done by simply moving supply-side settings to OECD average in cases where they're below the average, labour market is to do with things like employment protection rules and so on. Taxation is typically the balance between direct and indirect taxation. PMR is product market regulation. Product market regulation is basically barriers to entry of new businesses. Education is both about the quantity and quality of education. Notice that if Greece came up to the OECD average, the OECD predicts its GDP would rise by over 40%. That is the background to some of the discussions about Greek debt. The bad news, just to sort of go back to history, is my own take on the past is that when you get periods of long stagnation, bad times if you like, I'm not convinced that that's good for supply-side policy. I have the feeling that actually it encourages more protectionist impulses. It encourages populism, which is not very market-friendly. And certainly the 1930s experience of that was really quite bad. Let me just say then a little bit about creative destruction. The dark side of technological change, the entry of the new, combined with the exit of the old. All the evidence that we have sitting out there is that Europe, and especially Southern Europe, is much less good at doing creative destruction than the United States. There are barriers to exit, barriers to entry, and we observe a much bigger spread of productivity across firms, across industries as a result. You do not see the same tendency for resources to move to the highly productive areas of the economy quickly. That's really quite an important element in this failure for productivity to grow and accounts for a substantial part of the productivity gap. Andrews and Singano is a recent study in the journal Economic Policy. Successful lobbying by losers or potential losers slows down or blocks the diffusion of new technology. Barriers to entry, EPL, employment protection legislation. Now let's turn to the robots, just to cheer ourselves up before we finish. People have taken a lot of interest in the future of robots, particularly me. I really want this robot world. I'm hopeless at cooking, I don't like mowing the lawn. I see the robot as my perfect solution to these problems, especially as it gets very cheap. And as it gets very cheap, it's going to remove the chef and the gardener, if you think about it. Okay, a recent very careful, very detailed projection says almost half of American employment, as it was in 2010, has about a 70% chance or more of being computerized by 2035. That will, of itself, if that were to happen, that would generate labour productivity growth probably at least 1.5% a year over that interval. But this projection also says the jobs that will disappear are predominantly low wage and low skill. The skill bias will be extremely pronounced. Much low-wage service employment is fit. Be pleased to know this study, I looked very carefully, doesn't think a robot will be giving this talk in 25 years' time. I'm relaxed about that. I think that's very good. There are some numbers. Robots are actually increasingly at work already. The diffusion is rapidly underway, and we can see something about what's been happening. That's an excellent CEPR discussion paper recently. Robots are substituted for workers as they become cheaper. It's true that output in those sectors will probably increase as its price falls. The overall effect from a modelling point of view on employment, the direct effect is ambiguous. It relies on two elasticities of substitution: epsilon, the elasticity of substitution in consumption; sigma, the elasticity of substitution between robots and workers. Gretz and Michaels show quite clearly that the evidence so far is that robots are reducing low-skill employment and doing so quite rapidly. The evidence that goes with that is, in the past, Europe has been much less good at dealing with this problem than the United States, because of the labour market institutions that it has. The most famous labour market model of unemployment probably is the Mortensen and Pissarides one, which is the kind of matching labour market, lots of search and so on. Mortensen and Pissarides' 1999 paper suggests that Europe is about 1/12 as good as the United States in dealing with an increase in productivity spreads across workers. That suggests labour market policies will matter. Elizabeth's been giving me the 2 minutes for about the last 4 minutes, so she'll be pleased to see this is the last slide. I always put conclusions on the last slide. I think that's fairly logical, and that's the point at which people can wake up. Okay, so if you were asleep during most of the talk, shame on you, but what you would have learned had you been awake is, firstly, that it's not obvious that future growth prospects are as bad as time series econometrics suggests from trying to extract the trend from the recent past. My own take is that the prospects for future productivity growth are quite strong. I do not believe that technological progress is exhausted. I think actually we're on the eve of quite important technological development. Second point, that won't necessarily free us from secular stagnation in the sense of Hansen's worries, because that opens the possibility that rather than a low productivity growth world, we might have a high unemployment world. The high unemployment world might come not so much from slow technological progress, but the skill bias that it has and the stress that it puts on the labour market in terms of reabsorbing those low-educated, low-skilled workers into alternative jobs. If you were listening right at the start, I think this is more like Hansen's 1932 problem than Hansen's 1939 problem. And just to show off, because I knew Marcus was coming and he likes a touch of classicals, the last bullet point says, this looks like being between a rock and a hard place for Europe, or as the classicals would have said, it's Scylla and Charybdis. Thank you.